Hi guys, welcome back to the Self Growth Diaries podcast. This is episode 6, I believe. Today we are going to be talking about how to observe yourself, to observe your surroundings, your environment, and how to observe other people. Because sometimes we don't observe ourselves or other people or our environment, and we don't realize that's the thing that's holding us down. And once we realize that thing is holding us down, we can build up from it. As I've said in many other podcast episodes, we can build from it and outsmart people. We can understand why people do certain things, why we can understand their actions, we can understand our actions, and why we even do those actions as well. So the first entry we're going to be talking about is what is observing other people or environment. Second entry we're going to be talking about today is how do I observe? Because there are right and wrong ways to observe. Number 3, why should we observe ourselves, our environment, and other people around us? And as always, at the end of each podcast episode, I am going to be telling you how do I apply this and the information you learned here into your actual life. So let's get started. So number 1, our first entry is what is observing? And it's a very subjective definition, I would say, but for me, observing is looking and kind of analyzing how another person, actions, or an environment works. If I were to say I'm observing my friend, I am basically saying, hey, I am analyzing, I am seeing how my friend acts or how she reacts. And as I said, observing is a very open topic. It's a very subjective topic, and you can have your own definition for it, but I think that's just my definition for observing. Number 2, how do I observe? Now, as I said, there were wrong and right ways, and let's start talking about the wrong way first. So when you get into observing other people or yourself, the wrong way is to, when you observe people, you kind of assume that you know their intentions, you know what they're doing, you know why they're doing this or why that they're that person, and that's completely wrong. For observing yourself and observing other people, you don't assume, but you can kind of correlate emotions with things or actions. So when you assume, you obviously assume. An assumption is when you have a statement that's without proof, right? You're assuming that they're doing that because they have a bad intention, or they're just really emotional, or some other reason. And they might not be doing it because of that, because we're all humans, we're a complex character, and we're not really that predictable. And observing the wrong way can probably give you inaccurate data about the person. It can make you have false assumptions for yourself and other people. It can kind of make you think that they're a certain person that in reality they're not. Now, observing the right way is when you look at a person's actions or your own actions, you don't judge, you don't assume at first, because you don't know why you're doing that. You don't know why the other person's doing that. You can come up with reasons, right? I've actually looked in one of my classes before, and everybody was like having their hand on their face, or like kind of resting their head on their hand, and I saw about like 10 people do that. And I wondered, like, why do they do that? Like, it almost looked like a copy and paste of each person but in a different chair. It was super weird. And I asked myself this question. I'm like, well, why do you do that? And then I think, well, because I want to rest my head, or I'm just really tired and I want to look like I'm learning, or number 3, I just do it I don't really know why I do it. And so I kind of took those things into account from observing myself, and I kind of correlated, as I said, with why they're doing that. And obviously I'm not assuming, but I'm correlating with it, and I'm like, well, they could be doing it because of X, Y, and Z, right? They could be, but they could also not be. They could just be doing it for just because. Or they can be doing it for a completely different reason, or maybe they're trying to hide something, or there's so many reasons, there's so many observations, there is so many basically reasons. There's so many reasons that they could be doing that, and yours might not be one. And that's why it's important to continuously observe, which I'll talk about in the next entry. But if you observe right, if you don't make assumptions about a person, you can't really assume who they actually are. Because when we assume who they actually are or why they're doing this, we kind of come attached, or we come familiar with as well, a fake version of themselves. We almost put them in a box, and we think that they are this, and this, right? And that actually might not be true. We put them in a box, and this could be good or bad. We put them in a bad box. We think, oh yeah, they're so mean, or they're tired, or they're lazy, or they don't really care. And it could also be a good box. We're like, oh, well, I think they're happy, or I think that they are popular, or I think that they're confident. And both of those boxes can be really bad if you interpret them that way, if you keep on feeding those delusions, and if you keep on feeding those expectations for yourself. So as I said, with good observing, don't assume. Just kind of look, and kind of look inwards to yourself, and kind of say like, well, why do I do that? And if you don't know why you do that, that's okay. I don't know why I do that. I don't know why I do certain things. And if I look from the past and I see how I was feeling in that moment, it kind of helps. Feelings and emotions, we don't really forget. We forget the experiences, the persons, the people, the memories. We forget all of that, but we don't forget the feeling that gave us, or the emotion that was triggered when that moment happened. I feel like emotions play a big role when you're trying to observe people, because when you're observing people, you should also look at their face. You should also look at your body language, or your/their body language. And when you look for that body language, look for either tense, relaxed, kind of like gestures. I mean, there's not a way to categorize them. They're very subjective, they're very open, and they're not the best reliable source. Okay, they're not the best thing, but facial expressions can definitely help you for how they're feeling or what emotion is in them. And when I looked at all of those people who were resting their head on their hand, most of them, they looked tired. Like they were so out of it. They were so tired, their eyes were droopy, and like they were just not smiling at all. Some people, they were kind of just there and were kind of bored. They didn't look like they wanted to learn, right? And some of them just looked normal, I guess, right? But that's an assumption. We don't make those assumptions. So we put that aside. And I think I might have mentioned this in another podcast episode, but there's a difference between facts and your emotional thinking. So if you're emotionally thinking while you're observing people, then you're obviously going to think with your emotions. You're going to think that they're doing this out of anger, out of happiness, or out of stress. And you can kind of separate that and be like, what's one fact? Okay, well, a fact is that they're resting their head on their hand. That's a fact. What is another fact? Their eyes are droopy. See, that's another fact. And we can sometimes correlate our emotions with those facts and kind of come up with an inference, or I guess a prediction about why they're doing that action or why we are doing that action. Now, for all this entry, I've been talking about other people, but now let's talk about ourselves. How do we observe ourselves in the wrong way? And it's basically what I just said about other people. You can observe in the wrong way. You can observe yourself and think, I'm doing this because blah, 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 and you might actually not be doing it because of that. You might be assuming things about yourself. And if you assume things about yourself, you start to feel bad. You start to actually believe that what you're doing is because of that. And the emotion inside you was triggered by that. Or the action that you did, you always do that. And it's bad. It's a bad habit. And you kind of start to beat yourself up about it. It's not true. Obviously, it's an assumption. Assumptions are statements without evidence. They're without proof. You can't really prove that. And you might be like, oh, well, but my mind does. My mind always proves it to me. Well, that's because you're making opportunities for it to prove it to you. You're still making those opportunities. You're still making those doors so your brain could find those little nooks and crannies and prove that prove that to yourself. Now, what you need to do is just close all of those. And if you can't close all of those, just know that it's your mind. Your mind is not a fact. What you're saying in your mind is not a fact. I bet probably 50% of what you're saying in your mind is not a fact. It is an emotional opinion, or it is just an opinion. It's not a fact. Okay? And let me repeat that. A fact is something with evidence, and an opinion is what you think. And it could have proof or without proof, but it's just your opinion. It's your statement that you believe. Now, to observe the right way, it's the same, okay? With other people and yourself, it's the same. You still observe yourself, or you can even observe yourself in the moment or even in the past. That might help. And think, well, why do I always do that? And again, look for those emotions that were triggered inside of you when that moment happened. So say if you were at a dinner and you just felt really uncomfortable and you were like really twitching a lot, your hands were shaking, and like you were kind of like doing something with your hands, you were fidgeting, and you might think, well, why was I doing that? Then you go back to that night, and then you kind of find out, you're like, oh, that's why I was doing that, because the conversation said this, or I didn't really like this person that was sitting there, or some other reason. And as I said, you can correlate but not assume. That's the big part, because if you assume, you're going to go in a spiral and you're going to start to believe that about yourself. Same thing if you don't. If you observe yourself and think, oh, well, maybe I was doing that because I was tired, or this, and this. Then your brain thinks, okay, well, I was doing this because of X, and this. So I don't have a valid reason, but I still did it. That's fine. And then you kind of just forget about it, which is kind of the goal. But you're going to want to keep those really smart, those very important observations, like why you get nervous around a certain person, or why you fidget the way you do, or why you always sit with your knees crossed, or whatever, right? You want to keep those observations to help you in the future and to also heal and grow yourself. And I think I forgot this person, and it was in Robert Greene's book of The Laws of Human Nature, and I think his name was Erikson, and I remember he was paralyzed, I think, and he couldn't move because he got into a crash, and he could talk, but he never really talked that often, and obviously he couldn't move, and he was kind of in the same home with his family, and he also had sisters, and what he did like every single day was observe them and observe how they act. And most of the time, when you start out observing yourself, when you start observing your environment or other people, you're kind of confused, you're kind of you're drifting apart, right? Because we have a short attention span. But when we continuously observe people, you kind of become fascinated. With his sisters, he always looked at them, and maybe one sister was saying, "Hey, do you want to go to the movies?" And the other sister was like, "Oh, I guess so." And then he kind of took that as interpretation and was like, "Well, why didn't she say that she just didn't want to go?" And that is another thing too. You have to clearly kind of state your observation, or kind of clearly state your emotion that you are feeling. And even with those observations, you can even ask yourself those questions, like, why wasn't I clearly stating my feelings? Why wasn't I clearly stating my needs? Why wasn't I being clear with my actions? And mind you, Erikson kept doing this for, I think like 5 years. That's when he started to walk again. That's when he started to kind of, get better. That's when he started to walk again. And throughout all those years, he observed himself. He observed sisters. He observed how when people came around him, there was like sweat on their foreheads, or they were just shaking, or their eyes. You can really tell a lot about eyes. I mean, I use this a lot, like the eye contact you make, or it's just something about the eyes. The eyes never lie. You guys might have heard that, but I believe it, because when you look at their eyes, your subconscious kind of knows like their intentions, or kind of like correlates, or kind of has a feeling of what they're feeling, or what their emotions are, or what they are to you. Okay, so this is sub-entry number 3. That was a really long entry right there. And it is, why should we observe? And I kind of said this before in the second sub-entry, but it's important to observe because you grow yourself. You can observe yourself and think, how can I better myself? And you might not see it when you observe other people. Obviously, that's a whole different thing. But why you should observe other people, and this is the first sub-entry we're going to be talking about, is why should we observe other people? Simply because to understand them more. To understand humans more is a lot. I mean, we don't even understand how our brain works yet. We don't understand how our heart works yet, okay? We literally discovered 5% or 10% of the ocean, okay? And it's really important to understand humans because we can understand where they're coming from, or what caused them to do that, or we just have more compassion for them. We feel what they're going through. And once you start to observe other people, you can start to also observe criminals, right? And this is like the base. This is what I've been wanting to talk about, the base. If you observe criminals in the way they act, they don't act the same, obviously, because no human is the same. But once you observe those criminals and you kind of see why they did that, why they killed a person, or why they decided to abduct a person, and you kind of go back and you kind of see their childhood, which is the main thing. Your childhood matters, guys. If you do a certain action, or if you know someone really well and you just started observing them and you know about their childhood and you also know yours, that's a big thing. Childhood can play in your emotions, in your actions. And if you look back at the criminal and you see their childhood and you kind of look at it and you're like, well, that was a bad childhood. Or maybe you look at it and you're like, well, that's an okay childhood. And then you kind of gather the things from there. Like, say, maybe, I don't know, let's just call him Joe. Joe, I don't know, killed a person, right? Then you go back to his childhood and you see that his mother and father both abused him, right? And he was bullied at school, right? And maybe he was working all the time to support his family as well. And we can correlate that. We cannot assume that. And we can correlate that. And we can think, well, if both of my parents abused me, right, how would I feel? Well, I would feel anxious. I would feel scared. I would feel not safe, right? And that's part of what he felt. And as I said before, you can take those emotions with you and use them as justification for your actions, and maybe that's why he killed the person, right? But that's an assumption. It's not a fact, but that's an opinion/assumption, right? But we don't like to assume. So we can correlate that and be like, maybe he did it because of this, this, and this, right? It's correlation. We're not assuming anything because we don't know the other person, and every person looks through every person in a different lens. We don't view the same person in the same lens, if you kind of get what I'm saying. Like, you guys might view me as a podcaster, someone else might view me as a friend, someone else might view me as a daughter, someone else might view me as a hater, someone else might view me as whatever else, right? We all view everyone else as different people because we all have different experiences with them. And once you kind of learn that, and if you observe people, right, just random people, or even people who used to be your friend, you can kind of use those past experiences and kind of apply/correlate them here. You can see why they're doing that, or if you remember what they talked about with you, then you can kind of correlate that. You can be like, oh, they talked about this with me, and oh, wait, and kind of make those connections, and then you start to understand the human mind and the human much better. Okay, and let's go back to the second sub-entry is why should I observe myself? To observe yourself is to grow. To observe yourself is to make progress, and to observe yourself is to want to make a change. To observe yourself, it means that you want to change, you want to grow, you want to make progress because you want to change, or you want to kind of evolve yourself. You want yourself to evolve, you want yourself to make better decisions, you want yourself to have a better life, you want a better diet, or all of those things. And if you start to observe yourself, like, say if I went to the pantry every time and immediately I would look at junk food and I would grab it, right? And then kind of go back and be like, well, why do I do that? Well, because A, and this is a fact, junk food is bad for you, okay? Number 2, because it's right there in front of me. Number 3, maybe because in childhood I had a lot of desserts. I had a lot of junk food while growing up. Now, we obviously don't assume, we correlate. As I've said throughout this whole podcast episode, to correlate. Don't assume, but just correlate it. And if you correlate it, you can kind of give yourself reasons why you did that. And as I said, your brain takes those reasons and kind of says, well, I don't have a valid reason. I can't really prove each and one of those. And as I said, if your brain continuously tries to prove to yourself that you're one of those reasons and that the reason you did that is because of that reason, then there's some nook or cranny or some opportunity that's making your brain go that way. and making those assumptions about yourself. Okay? Now, the fourth sub-entry, or the fourth entry we're going to be talking about is, how do I apply this to my daily life, to my lifestyle? And this was hard for me to actually integrate, because I thought observing people would be like full on observing. Like, I would have to like observe them every minute and like not listen to the lecture and just kind of observe, or maybe just always look at a person and observe them, right? And that's like not true. To observe yourself, to observe a person, you can even look back on past experiences. You can go back to your past. That is observing yourself. That is how you apply it. You can go back to your past life and go back to your memories and kind of observe yourself from there. That helps you, that grows you, that makes you get progress. And to also observe people in real life during your busy schedule, what you can do instead of looking at your phone, or maybe while you're looking at your phone, maybe look up once in a while and kind of look at the people around you and kind of see the way they talk, the way they walk, the way they're feeling, the way like they kind of rush, or maybe the way they walk, or I already said that, the way they walk, or the way they carry themselves, right? And you're kind of gonna notice a lot, because if you're in a busy street or if you're in a busy city, you're not gonna have time to observe other people. You want to get moving, right? But a little reminder to just slow down, observe yourself, observe what's going around you, observe the people around you. And once you kind of take that in, and guys, crowds are like the best thing ever. I forgot to add this in one of my entries. Crowds are the best things. Crowds is where you find and observe so much good information. As I said, I looked in my class and I found like 10 people doing the same thing, right? And I obviously don't know why. And that's why crowds are so big. That's why crowds are so important. When you look at a crowd, or when you look at a group of people in your everyday life, you kind of just even glance at them. You don't even have to fully look at them. You can glance at them and you can see what they're doing and be like, oh, that's weird, or oh, that's cool, or oh, why are they all doing this, or oh, why do they all dress the same, or oh, why do they, And those questions start to race in your mind, and then you start to observe people more, and you start to observe yourself even more, because you want to know that reason. You want to know why they do those things. And as I said, you can't always really have a valid reason of why they do that, of your actions, of the emotion that was triggered inside of you. We can't really ever have a valid reason. And even in your everyday life, as I said, you can just glance. Like, you can just glance at the person. You don't have to fully look. And as I said, observing a person or observing yourself does not mean 24/7. It does not mean you have to look at them every single hour and not take your eyes off them. It means just those small moments. You can even glance. You can even look at their feet, right? And this might be a weird thing, but I always look at my feet and my classmates' feet, because that's when I kind of correlate things. That's when maybe if they're shaking their foot, from the floor, then I kind of correlate with myself, well, why do I do that? And I'm like, well, I do that because I'm anxious, because I'm stressed. And then again, correlate it. That's why in your everyday life, you can literally just glance at someone's foot. And if they're all still, or if they cross their legs, or if they're tapping their foot from the ground, or if they're making sounds, or if their fists are clenched, or if their hands are just free, or if they're just very articulate. And once you start to do that in your everyday life, once you start to glance, once you start to observe how the people act, you kind of get more information about how the actual human creature acts. And as I said, to apply this in your everyday life, just glance. Glance, glance, glance. Or if you do have enough time, definitely observe yourself, definitely observe your body language, and then you can kind of observe someone else's. You don't even have to make the facts/opinions chart when you're there. You can literally just take it in. You can be like, oh, my feet are crossed, and oh, those two other people are walking the same, or oh, you don't have to make those assumptions or opinions yet. And maybe this can even be in like the past. Maybe that could have been yesterday, and today you can now reflect on it and be like, oh, why did I do that? And again, you might not always have a valid reason, and that's okay. And I think that's the main thing, to apply this in your real life, that you're not always going to have a valid reason for anything or for why people do certain things. You're not going to have a reason. You're not going to have a valid reason, right? And even if they give you a verbal reason to why they did that, it's A, not true, B, true, or C, none of the above. Like, it's very fishy. It's almost like an assumption, right? Let's go back to the criminal thing for a second. To apply this in your everyday life, kind of observe people like how you would observe a criminal. A criminal, you would observe everything he does. You would observe his childhood, his actions, how he's holding his hands. Do the same thing with just regular old people, even with strangers, even with your friends, even with your parents, even with yourself. So I think this is the end of the podcast episode. I talked about a lot of things. I probably just repeated a lot of things, but let me remind you that our first entry was what is observing, and the definition, or my definition of it, which is, again, an opinion, not a fact. Number 2, how do we observe ourselves, people, our environment, our actions, and our emotions to better understand them? Number 3, why should we? Why should we observe? Why should we analyze what we do? And number 4, how do I apply this into my actual life? And to recap from all of that, glance. I repeated this so many times, but glance or look just for a second, and it might give you all the information that you need. So I will see you guys in the next podcast episode.